3 days had passed since the Battle of Myra 7, and the anvil of stars floated in the void like a wounded animal that refused to die. The ship had survived against all odds, and emergency repairs had stabilized the most critical systems. And rescue vessels from Coalition space had arrived to evacuate the wounded and bring supplies to those who remained. Thera walked through the medical bay, and she had never seen anything quite like what she witnessed there. The human casualties were staggering, and the Anvil of Stars had lost 60% of its crew during the battle, and the medical bay was filled with bodies wrapped in white sheets and survivors who bore wounds that would have killed most other species. But the refugees were safe. 2 million civilians had jumped to safety because the humans had held the line, and that number kept repeating in Thera's mind as she walked past rows of injured soldiers. She stopped beside a familiar bed and looked down at Lieutenant Commander Tanaka, who was propped up against pillows with monitoring devices attached to her body. Tanaka had lost her remaining arm during the final hours of the battle when an explosion had torn through the deck where she was coordinating damage control. And now both of her arms were mechanical prosthetics that had not yet been calibrated. Ambassador, Tanaka said with a weak smile, I was wondering when you would come to visit. I wanted to understand something, Thera said, and she pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. And I hope you will help me. I will try. Thera was quiet for a long moment as she gathered her thoughts, and she looked at this small human woman who had given both her arms in service to a cause greater than herself. Why did you fight so hard? She finally asked, and I do not mean the tactical reasons because I understand those. And I mean, why did you personally choose to keep fighting when every rational calculation said you should stop? Tanaka turned her head to look out the small window that showed the stars beyond, and her expression was thoughtful rather than sad. When I was a little girl on Earth, my grandmother told me a story about a man who saw a stranger drowning in a river, and the man jumped in to save the stranger, even though he could not swim very well. And people asked him afterward why he would risk his life for someone he did not know. She looked back at Thera with eyes that held pain and exhaustion, but also something else that burned beneath the surface. The man said that he saw someone who needed help, and he knew he could help, and so he did, and it was not more complicated than that. Thera considered this answer and found that it did not satisfy her completely. But you could have died, and many of your people did die, and the strangers you saved will never even know your names. Does that matter? Tanaka asked the question was genuine and not rhetorical, and Thera realized that the human was actually curious about her perspective. To my people, it would matter very much, Thera admitted, because we believe that actions should be measured by their outcomes and that sacrifice should be proportional to reward. Then I suppose humans are not very good at proportional sacrifice, Tanaka said with a small laugh that made her wince, because we have a long history of dying for things that cannot love us back. She gestured with one of her new mechanical hands at the window and the stars beyond. We die for flags and ideals and people we have never met. And we die for the chance that someone somewhere might have a better life because of what we did. And we do not need to know their names or receive their thanks. Thera felt something shift in her understanding, and it was like watching a puzzle piece finally fall into place. You find meaning in the sacrifice itself. We find meaning in the choice, Tanaka corrected gently, because anyone can sacrifice when they have no options. And the meaning comes from choosing to give when you could have chosen to keep. A medical officer approached and told Tanaka that she needed to rest. And Thera rose from her chair and prepared to leave. But she paused at the door. I have one more question, if you will permit it. Of course. Do you regret it? Tanaka looked at her new mechanical arms and then at the window and then back at Thera. And her smile was small but genuine. I regret the friends I lost, and I regret the pain that their families will carry. and I regret that the universe required such a price to be paid." She met Thera's eyes with an intensity that made the ambassador's 4 hearts beat faster. "But I do not regret standing with them. And I do not regret fighting, and if I had to make the choice again, I would make the same one." Thera nodded and left the medical bay with thoughts swirling. Through her mind like leaves in a storm, she made her way to another room where Admiral Solomon Cross lay. Dying, his injuries had been too severe for the medical technology available, and he had refused to accept extensive life extension treatment that might have saved him. And instead, he had directed those resources to younger crew members who he said had more years ahead of them to use. He was surrounded by his surviving officers when Thera entered, and they stood at attention around his bed like an honor guard. And their eyes were red with grief, but their backs were straight. "Ambassador," Cross said, and his voice was a whisper compared to the thunder it had been during the battle. "I am glad you came. I wanted to thank you," Thera said. "And I wanted to ask you something." "Ask." "You told the hegemony commander that you fought for the refugees, and I believe that was true. But I want to know if there was something more." Cross was quiet for a long moment, and his breathing was labored, and his eyes were growing dim. But he managed a smile. "There is an old saying on Earth," he said, "that greater love has no one than this. That someone lay down their life for their friends. Do you consider the Volanthi your friends?" Thera asked. "Even though my people doubted you and dismissed your capabilities?" "I consider anyone worth dying for a friend," Cross replied. "And it is not complicated, and it does not require the other person to earn it or deserve it." He closed his eyes and his officers moved closer, and Thera stepped back to give them space. Admiral Solomon Cross died an hour later with his crew standing at attention around him, and they did not leave until his last breath had faded into silence. Thera returned to her quarters and began writing her report to the Volanthi High Council. And it was unlike anything she had ever written before. She did not describe human military capabilities in dry statistics or clinical assessments, and instead she wrote about a species that ran toward danger when every instinct should have told them to flee. Wrote about creatures who laughed in the face of death and sang war songs while their ships burned around them. And she wrote about a small woman who gave both her arms and did not regret it. And she wrote about an old man who gave his life and called it a gifter. Final conclusion was simple, and it changed everything. We have spent centuries categorizing humans as a young and unremarkable species, and we have noted their physical weaknesses and their short lifespans and their emotional nature. And we have dismissed their warrior myths as primitive self-glorification. We were wrong. Humans are what happens when evolution creates a creature with the body of prey and the soul of a predator. And they are afraid and they fight anyway, and they break and they keep going, and they die and they smile while doing it. The myths were never exaggerations. They were warnings. And I am grateful beyond measure that humanity has chosen to stand with us rather than against us. The Volanthi High Council read her report and voted unanimously for full military alliance with the United Terran Systems. And when the memorial service was held for the fallen of Mira 7, Thera stood among humans and Kreth and a dozen other species, and she listened to the names of the dead being read aloud. When the human hymns began, she found herself singing along, and the words were unfamiliar, but the meaning was clear. Some things were worth dying for, and humanity had shown her what those things looked like. The Anvil of Stars was dying, and everyone on board knew it. Half the ship's decks had been destroyed or sealed off due to catastrophic damage, and the engines were failing, and fires burned in sections that no longer had crews to fight them. And the once mighty dreadnought was held together by emergency force fields, and the desperate work of engineers who refused to give up Thera had been moved to the bridge because there was nowhere else left that was safe. and she stood in the corner trying to stay out of the way while humans fought to keep their ship alive. Admiral Cross sat in his command chair with blood soaking through the bandages on his chest, and shrapnel had torn through his body during an explosion on the lower decks. And his medical officer had begged him to go to the infirmary, and he had refused. "I will leave this bridge when the battle is over," he had said. And not one moment before, the tactical display showed a grim picture that would have broken the spirit of any reasonable commander. And the coalition fleet had been reduced to less than half its original strength. And the hegemony forces still outnumbered them significantly, but the evacuation transports were charging their hyperspace drives. And in 90 minutes, they would be able to jump to safety. And all the coalition had to do was hold the line for 90 more minutes. It seemed impossible. The main view screen flickered, and a new face appeared. And it was a hegemony commander with the distinctive scaled features and predatory eyes of his species. And his mandibles clicked in what Thera recognized as amusement. "Human Admiral," the hegemony commander said, "your fleet is broken, and your ship is dying. And you have fought well for prey animals, but the outcome is inevitable." Admiral Cross said nothing and simply stared at the screen with an expression that revealed nothing. "I offer you terms," the hegemony commander continued. "Surrender your remaining vessels and the civilian transports, and I will grant your crews quick deaths instead of the slow ones they will suffer if they continue to resist." Thera watched the humans on the bridge and waited for the despair to show on their faces. And she waited for the arguments about accepting terms and saving what lives they could. No one spoke. No one moved. And then Admiral Cross did something that Thera did not expect. Laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. And it was not the warm laughter she had heard from humans in diplomatic settings. And it carried something dark and hungry that made the scales on the hegemony commander's face ripple with what might have been uncertainty. "You think this is over," Admiral Cross said. And his voice was soft, but it carried across the silent bridge like thunder. "You look at your numbers and your undamaged ships, and you think you have won." He leaned forward in his chair, and the movement made him wince with pain, but he did not stop. "Let me tell you something about humanity that your intelligence reports did not include. And let me tell you the one thing that separates us from every other species you have ever conquered." The hegemony commander's eyes narrowed, but he did not interrupt. "We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day," Admiral Cross said, "and we survived ice ages and plagues and predators and famines. And we did not survive by being stronger or faster or smarter than the things that hunted us." He smiled, and it was the smile of something that had stopped pretending to be tame. "We survived by being too stubborn to die. And we survived by chasing our prey until they collapsed from exhaustion. And we survived because when something hurt us, we did not run away, we got angry." He opened a channel to all human ships, and his next words were heard by every surviving crew member in the fleet. "Show them what we are." What happened next broke something fundamental in Thera's understanding of the universe. The pyramidal human ships stopped fighting defensively. They attacked. The battered remains of the Terran fleet surged forward with a ferocity that seemed to come from nowhere. And ships that should have been limping to safety were instead charging directly at the enemy. And their weapons fired continuously, even as their hulls crumbled around them. Marine boarding pods launched from every human vessel that could still deploy them. And Thera watched the tactical display as hundreds of tiny dots raced toward hegemony ships and latched onto their hulls. "What are the Marines doing?" Soren asked with horror in his voice. "They are boarding the enemy ships," Tanaka said. And her voice held something that sounded almost like reverence. "They are going to fight them hand to hand." Reports began flooding in from hegemony vessels that had been boarded, and the enemy communications were filled with confusion and fear as human Marines cut through their corridors like fire. Through dry grass, the hegemony Forces had never faced this kind of assault. They were predators who had conquered a dozen species by overwhelming force. And they had never encountered prey that attacked the hunters. And they did not know how to respond when their victims started hunting them instead. A Terran destroyer with its engines destroyed used its last power reserves to accelerate directly into a hegemony carrier. And the collision turned both ships into an expanding cloud of debris that tore through the enemy formation. Another ship overloaded its reactor deliberately, and the explosion created a hole in the hegemony line that other human vessels immediately exploited. Tanaka moved to stand beside Thera, and her voice was quiet as she explained what Thera was witnessing. Humans are persistent predators, Ambassador, and we evolved to chase our prey across entire continents until they collapsed from exhaustion. And our ancestors did not need to be faster or stronger because they only needed to be relentless. She gestured at the view screen, where the hegemony fleet was beginning to fragment as ships broke formation to escape the human assault. Other species have fight or flight responses, Tanaka continued, and they evaluate threats and make rational decisions about when to engage and when to withdraw. Her mechanical hand clenched into a fist. Humans have a third option, and we call it spite. And it means that sometimes we would rather destroy ourselves and our enemies together than accept defeat. The hegemony commander's face appeared on the view screen again, and his earlier confidence was gone. And his scales were pale, and his eyes darted from side to side as damage reports flooded his bridge. "This is madness," he snarled. "You are throwing away your lives for nothing, Admiral." Cross leaned back in his chair, and blood dripped from his lips, but his smile never wavered. "Not for nothing," he said. "For them." He pointed at the tactical display where the evacuation transports were finally beginning their jump sequence. And 2 million refugees were about to escape to safety because humans have decided that their lives were worth dying for hegemony. Commander stared at the display, and something in his predator's eyes shifted as understanding dawned. "You were never trying to win," he said. "Slowly, we were trying to hold the line," Admiral Cross replied. "And we did." The hegemony fleet began to retreat. And it was not an orderly withdrawal, but a panicked rout, as ships fled from enemies that refused to stop coming even when they were dying. Thera watched the predators run from what they had thought was prey. And she understood now why the stories about humanity had spread so far and so fast. The stories were not exaggerations. They were warnings, and the hegemony had not listened. The battle was nothing like the simulations Thera had studied during her diplomatic training. And it was nothing like the sanitized reports she had read in the comfort of her office on the Volanthi homeworld. It was noise, and fire, and the screaming of metal being torn apart by forces beyond imagination. The observation deck shook with each impact against the hull, and the lights flickered between normal illumination and the red emergency glow that painted everything in the color of blood. And the air was filled with the constant chatter of damage reports and casualty counts. Thera gripped the railing with all 4 of her hands and watched the tactical display with growing horror as coalition ships began to die. A Kreth destroyer took a direct hit to its reactor core and split apart in a blinding flash that left nothing but debris. And she could see the tiny specks of bodies tumbling through the vacuum. And she knew that each speck was a person who had been alive just moments before. "The medical frigate Gentle Hope has been destroyed," a tactical officer announced, and his voice was steady despite the chaos. "All hands lost, including the Volanthi medical team." Thera felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized that those had been her people on that ship. And they had come to help, and now they were gone. But the human ships did not break formation. She watched the anvil of stars absorb hit after hit, and each impact sent tremors through the deck and showers of sparks from damaged systems. and the damage reports came so fast that they blurred together into a constant stream of destruction. Hull breach on deck 7 through 12, someone called out. Fire. Suppression failing in engineering section 4. We have lost contact with forward gun batteries 1 through 6. Casualty reports indicate 30% losses in the starboard sections. Thera turned to look at the humans around her, and what she saw made her question everything she thought she knew about this species. They were not panicking. A crew member slumped at his station with blood pooling beneath his chair, and another human simply stepped over the body and took his place at the console. And she did not pause or hesitate or even look down. And her hands were already moving across the controls before she had fully settled into the seat. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka was coordinating damage control teams with calm efficiency, and blood ran from a gash on her forehead, but she did not seem to notice. And her mechanical arm moved in precise patterns as she directed resources to the areas of greatest need. Reroute power from non-essential systems to the forward shields, she ordered. And tell engineering that I do not care what they have to do, but I need those engines at 60% within the next 10 minutes. The ship shuddered again, and this time the impact was strong enough to knock several people off their feet. And Soren grabbed Thera to steady her, and his 4 hands were trembling with barely contained terror. We need to evacuate, he said urgently. We need to find an escape pod and leave before the ship is destroyed. And go where? Thera asked, and her voice was calmer than she felt. The enemy fleet stands between us and safety, and any escape pod would be destroyed within minutes. She turned back to the tactical display and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The Terran battlecruiser Defiant had taken critical damage and was venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. And by any reasonable assessment, it should have been retreating or at least holding position to minimize further damage. Instead, it was accelerating. The burning ship was moving directly toward the largest concentration of enemy vessels, and its remaining guns were firing continuously. And even from this distance, Thera could see secondary explosions rippling across its hull as systems failed one after another. What are they doing? She whispered. Tanaka glanced at the display, and her expression was a mixture of grief and fierce pride. They are buying time, she said simply. The Defiant's reactor will go critical in approximately 4 minutes, and Commander Chun has decided to make those 4 minutes count. Thera watched the dying ship plow into the enemy formation and saw hegemony vessels scatter to avoid the collision. And the Defiant's guns kept firing until the very last moment, when the ship vanished in an explosion that took 3 enemy cruisers with it. She accessed the ship's internal communication feeds without really thinking about what she was doing. And what she saw in those feeds would stay with her for the rest of her life. Marine with compound fractures in both his legs was dragging himself across a corridor floor toward a weapons console, and he left a trail of blood behind him, but he did not stop. And when he reached the console, he pulled himself up and started firing at enemy fighters through a manual targeting system. An engineering team was working in a compartment that had been opened to vacuum by a hull breach, and their suits were failing one by one as the cold and radiation took their toll, and they kept working anyway. And the last one finished her repairs and died with her hands still on the controls. A pilot was flying her fighter with manual controls because her Neuralink had been severed by shrapnel, and she was humming an old song from Earth as she lined up her attack run. And she did not stop humming, even when enemy fire tore through her cockpit. This is not possible, Thera said. And she was not sure if she was speaking to anyone or just trying to convince herself. No species can sustain this level of damage and keep fighting, and the psychological trauma alone should have broken them by now. Tanaka looked at her with eyes that held pain and exhaustion and something else that burned beneath the surface. You studied our myths and dismissed them as exaggeration, she said. And you looked at our bodies and saw weakness. And you heard our laughter and thought we did not understand the danger. She gestured at the chaos around them with her mechanical arm. This is what we are, Ambassador, and this is what we have always been. And when we have something worth fighting for, we do not stop until the fight is over or we are dead. The tactical display updated and showed the Coalition line buckling under the relentless assault. And 2 more human carriers had been destroyed, and the evacuation transports were still 3 hours from being able to jump to. Safety Admiral Cross's voice came over the communication system, and it was rougher than before, but still steady. All ships are ordered to hold the line at any cost, and no one retreats and no one surrenders. And we stand until the civilians are safe. No one argued, no one questioned it. Thera looked at the humans around her and realized that the myths she had dismissed were not exaggerations at all. They were understatements. The docking bay of the Anvil of Stars was chaos in motion, and Thera had never seen anything quite like it in all her years as a diplomat species. From a dozen worlds rushed past her in every direction. And there were Kreth warriors with their armored shells, and Goroth engineers with their massive frames, and Morthani medics with their 6 eyes scanning everything at once. And yet somehow none of them collided or slowed or stopped, but it was the humans who caught her attention. They moved differently from everyone else. And at first, Thera could not identify what made them stand out. And then she realized it was the absence of something rather than the presence of something. There was no panic in their movements. Every other species showed some sign of stress in the face of the coming battle. And the Kreth clicked their mandibles nervously, and the Goroth rumbled deep warnings to each other, and the Morthani kept glancing toward the exits. But the humans just flowed through the chaos like water through a riverbed. A young human officer approached them and saluted with one hand while the other held a datapad. And Thera noticed that his uniform was crisp and clean despite the emergency. Ambassador Velkos. I am Ensign Park, and I have been assigned to escort you to the observation deck, where you will be safe during the engagement. Safe is a relative term given the current situation, Thera replied. The young human smiled. And it was not a nervous smile or a forced smile, but something genuine and almost peaceful. The Anvil has never lost an ambassador yet. Ma'am, and we do not plan to start today. He led them through corridors that hummed with activity. And everywhere Thera looked, she saw humans preparing for battle with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. And yet there was something else beneath the efficiency that she struggled to name. They passed a group of Marines in heavy combat armor, who were checking their weapons and making final adjustments to their gear. And one of them was telling a joke that made the others laugh. And their laughter echoed off the metal walls like they had not a care in the universe. Are they not afraid? Soren asked quietly. Ensign Park glanced back at the Marines and shrugged with a casual ease that seemed entirely inappropriate. Probably. But fear does not help, so they do not let it drive. And there is an old human saying that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. They reached the observation deck and found it already occupied by several other diplomatic observers from various coalition species. And most of them were huddled together, speaking in hushed voices and watching the tactical displays with wide, frightened eyes. A human woman approached them, and Thera immediately noticed 2 things about her. And the first was that she walked with a noticeable limp, and the second was that her left arm was clearly mechanical. Ambassador Velkos. I am Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka, and I will be your liaison for the duration of this engagement. And please, let me know if you need anything at all. I need to understand why your fleet is not retreating, Thera said bluntly. Because the tactical situation is clearly hopeless, and any rational commander would withdraw to fight another day. Tanaka's expression did not change, but something flickered in her dark eyes. And it was not anger or offense, but something that looked almost like amusement, with respect. "Ambassador, retreating is not an option. And if you will look at the tactical display, I will explain why," she led through to a large holographic projection that showed the entire battle space. And the hegemony fleet was a swarm of red icons advancing toward the thin blue line of coalition defenders. "Behind our fleet are 6 civilian transports carrying 2 million refugees from the outer colonies," Tanaka said, "and their hyperspace drives will not be charged for another 6 hours. And if we retreat, then the hegemony will reach those transports before they can jump. Then you should negotiate," Thera said, "and offer concessions and buy time. The hegemony does not take prisoners from species they consider prey animals, Ambassador, and they have made it very clear that humanity falls into that category." Tanaka said this without emotion, and Thera found herself more disturbed by the calm delivery than she would have been by anger or fear. The main view screen flickered, and the face of a human male appeared. And he was older than most humans. Thera had met with gray hair cropped short and deep lines carved into his weathered face. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire ship. "This is Admiral Solomon Cross speaking to all coalition forces. And I want to thank each and every one of you for standing with us today." Thera watched the faces of the humans around her as their commander spoke, and she saw something in their expressions that she did not expect. They were not looking at their screens with dread or resignation, and they were not exchanging worried glances or making peace with their gods. And instead, they were leaning forward with an intensity that reminded her of predators catching a scent. "The enemy believes we are prey," Admiral Cross continued, "and they believe we will run when they bare their teeth. And they believe that humans are soft and weak and will break under pressure." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that made even Thera's 4 hearts beat faster. "Today we have been given a gift, and that gift is the chance to show them exactly how wrong they are. And that gift is the chance to stand in the gap between the innocent and those who would destroy them. And I know each of you will make them remember this day." A sound rose from the human crew members around the observation deck, and it started low and built until it filled the air. And Thera realized they were cheering not with fear or desperation, but with something that looked terrifyingly like hunger. Soren moved closer to her, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Ambassador, this is madness, and any rational species would seek another solution. And there must be some way to—" His words were cut off by the sound of alarms, and the voice of a tactical officer calling out that the hegemony fleet had opened fire. First enemy weapons struck the outer defensive perimeter, and Thera watched 2 coalition ships vanish from the display in bursts of light. And the battle had begun. She looked at Tanaka and saw the human woman staring at the view screen with an expression that held no surprise and no fear. And her mechanical hand was clenched into a fist, and her jaw was set with determination. "They chose this," Thera said softly, and she was not sure if she was speaking to Soren or to herself. "We always choose this," Tanaka replied without looking away from the battle. "Because someone has to." The anvil of stars shuddered as the first enemy weapons found their mark, and the lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance, Thera could hear the sound of humans singing. It was a war song, low and rhythmic and ancient, and it should have sounded desperate in the face of such overwhelming odds, but it did not sound desperate at all. It sounded like a promise. Ambassador Thera Velkos stood at the observation window of her ship and watched the stars blur past in streams of blue and white light. And she felt nothing but boredom as she reviewed the same intelligence reports she had read 100 times before. Her people, the Volanthi, were tall and graceful beings with skin that shimmered like pearls in sunlight. And they had 4 slender arms that moved with the precision of dancers. And they valued truth above all other things in the universe. Thera had spent 40 cycles studying alien species across the galactic arm. And in all that time, she had never encountered a species quite as strange as humanity. And it was not their bodies that puzzled her, or their technology, or even their short lifespans. It was their stories. "Ambassador, shall I continue with the briefing?" asked Soren, her young aide, who stood behind her with a datapad clutched in two of his 4 hands. "Yes. Continue," Thera said without turning from the window. "Though I suspect it will be more of the same nonsense." Soren cleared his throat and began to read from the compiled reports that Coalition intelligence had gathered about human military capabilities. And his voice carried the same skepticism that Thera herself felt. Human soldiers reportedly fought for 72 hours without rest during the Kepler Station incident. And when their ammunition ran out, they engaged the enemy with improvised weapons and their bare hands. And not a single human retreated until the civilians were evacuated. "Adrenaline," Thera said flatly. "A common stress hormone found in many species, and hardly unique to humans." There is also the account from the Battle of New Helsinki, where a human Marine survived 17 wounds that military physicians classified as fatal. And she continued fighting for another 6 hours before she finally collapsed. And even then she was conscious and giving tactical advice. "Exaggeration," Thera replied. "Every species tells heroic stories about their warriors. And the Kreth claim their soldiers can fight with their hearts removed. And we know that is physically impossible." Soren scrolled through more reports, and his expression grew more uncertain with each one he read. But he continued because the ambassador had ordered a complete briefing. Multiple sources describe humans laughing during combat. Ambassador, and not nervous laughter but genuine amusement. And one hegemony prisoner reportedly said that fighting humans was like fighting creatures who did not understand they were supposed to be afraid. Thera finally turned from the window and fixed her aide with a look that had silenced diplomats and generals alike. And her silver eyes held nothing but cool dismissal. "I have met humans, Soren, and I have shaken their soft hands and looked into their small eyes and shared meals with their ambassadors. And do you know what I saw?" "What did you see, Ambassador?" "I saw a young species that has existed for barely a cosmic moment. And I saw creatures who smile too much and laugh too easily and form attachments to everything they meet, including animals and machines, and even their enemies. And I saw beings who are so desperate to be liked that they will agree with almost anything you say." She walked to her desk and sat down with the fluid grace that all Volanti possessed. And she folded 2 of her hands while the other 2 pulled up holographic displays of human anatomy. They are not physically impressive by any measure. And they are slower than the Kreth, and weaker than the Gorath, and less resilient than the Morthani. And their senses are dull compared to most predator species. And they require 8 hours of unconsciousness every single day just to function. Then how do you explain the stories?" Soren asked. "I explain them the same way I explain all mythology," Thera said, "as the natural tendency of intelligent beings to glorify themselves. And humans are simply better at storytelling than most species. And their entertainment industry has spread these exaggerated tales across the coalition like a virus." She dismissed the holographic displays with a wave of her hand and turned her attention to the mission briefing for their destination. The Myra 7 system was a contested region on the edge of coalition space, and the hegemony had been pushing against the border for months, and a joint fleet had been assembled to defend the system and protect the civilian populations on the inner planets. Thera's mission was simple, and she resented being assigned to it because it was beneath her skills and experience. But the High Council wanted a senior diplomat to observe the human-led defense force and report on whether the Volanti should formalize their alliance with the United Terran systems. "I expect we will arrive to find a lot of posturing and political maneuvering," Thera told Soren. And the hegemony will make threats, and the coalition will make counter-threats, and eventually, someone will negotiate a settlement that satisfies no one. And I will write a report that recommends continued cautious engagement with humanity. You do not think there will be actual combat? The hegemony is aggressive but not foolish. And they know that a direct assault on a defended system would cost them more than they could gain. And this is all fear designed to test our resolve. Soren nodded and made notes on his datapad, and Thera returned to her work. And the hours passed in quiet routine as their ship carried them closer to what she expected would be a tedious diplomatic exercise. She was reviewing trade agreements when the ship lurched violently, and alarms began screaming throughout every corridor. What is happening? She demanded as she rose from her seat. The ship's captain appeared on her communication screen, and his opalescent skin had gone pale with what could only be fear. And his voice trembled as he spoke. Ambassador, we have exited hyperspace at the edge of the Myra 7 system, and there has been a serious miscalculation. Explain yourself clearly. The hegemony fleet arrived early. Ambassador, and it is not the border skirmish force that intelligence predicted. The captain transmitted visual data to her screen, and Thera felt her 4 hearts skip in their synchronized rhythm as she processed what she was seeing. The hegemony had sent a full invasion armada, and there were hundreds of warships filling the void between the stars. And they outnumbered the coalition defenders by at least 3-1. That is not possible, Soren whispered. Our intelligence said. Our intelligence was wrong. Thera cut him off. She stared at the tactical display and watched the tiny icons that represented coalition ships forming a defensive line. And she saw the even tinier icons of civilian transports clustered behind them like frightened animals hiding behind a fence, and she noticed something that made her pause. The human ships were not retreating or repositioning to escape, and they were not sending surrender signals or requesting negotiations. And instead, they were moving forward to anchor the center of the defensive line. They were preparing to fight an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. And they were doing it without hesitation. Ambassador, the captain said, we are being directed to dock with the coalition flagship for our safety. And it is a human vessel called the Anvil of Stars. Thera looked at the massive human dreadnought on her screen, and she thought about all the stories she had dismissed. And for the first time, she felt a small seed of doubt take root in her mind. Take us in. She ordered. Perhaps this mission would not be so boring after all.